Great. Well, welcome back, everyone. I'm Rachel Myers. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Low-Income Housing Alliance, and I have the honor today to introduce two amazing leaders as our next keynote presenters. Emily Cadik is the Executive Director of the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Coalition, where she leads advocacy to support affordable rental housing financed using the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. Diane Yentel is the President and CEO of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and a veteran of affordable housing policy. She is an expert who has given over 2 decades of her hard work to affordable housing and community development. We're honored to have them both here with us to share with us their vision for realizing the potential of President Biden's housing agenda and more. So please join me in welcoming Emily Cadik and Diane Yentel. So we'll start with Diane. Diane, can we start with the moment that we're in? What did the pandemic expose about our country's housing needs?
Sure, thanks, Rachel, and thanks to everybody at the Washington Housing Alliance for having me. So the pandemic certainly worsened and heightened the challenges that many of our country's lowest income and most marginalized people faced in paying the rent even before the pandemic. So, to really understand the eviction crisis that we faced time and again during the pandemic, we have to recognize where we were even before the pandemic came to our country, which was in the midst of a severe affordable housing crisis, where we had a shortage of 7 million homes affordable and available to the lowest income people. So another way of saying that same number is for every 10 of the lowest income households, there were fewer than 4 apartments affordable and available to them. And because we had such a shortage of homes for those lowest income people, we had about 10 million of the lowest income renter households that were paying at least half of their income towards rent each month. And many were paying much more, 60, 70, 80% of their income just to keep a roof over their heads. So when you have such limited income to begin with, and you pay so much of it for your home, you're always one financial emergency away from missing rent, facing eviction, and in worst cases, becoming homeless. So for many of those same households, the coronavirus and its financial fallout was that financial shock. They lost jobs, they lost hours at work, they lost wages, they had increased costs, and it was harder than ever for them to cobble together what they needed in order to make rent each month.
Thank you, Diane. Emily, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think Diane captured it very well, and I also just want to thank you for having us here during this very important time. There's certainly quite a bit going on that we're going to get into, but it's helpful to be able to step back and also talk about just this moment that we are in and how much the needs have grown. And for those of us who have been advocating for affordable housing for a little while, we've been saying for probably the better part of a decade, looking at the NLHC numbers and saying, the gap has always been around 10 or 11 million homes that we're short. And I think, coming out of the pandemic, we don't even know what those numbers are going to look like 6 months, a year from now, and what the long-term effects are going to be. So I think, we all know that the needs are greater. I think one of the things that's been interesting coming out of this is how much more aware policymakers are of the need for an affordable home. And the way that housing kind of flew under the radar as a policy issue before has certainly not been the case. And want to give credit to both the advocates here and in your audience who helped make sure that housing was a huge part of the coronavirus response. And it's going to be up to us to see what we can do over these critical next few days, weeks, months, whatever it ends up being, to see how we can build on that momentum, keep reminding policymakers of that need and how much it's grown and how we can't miss this moment to really respond to the crisis in a meaningful way.
Thank you. That's certainly true here in Washington, that lawmakers, policymakers are thinking about housing. Diane, let's talk a little bit about eviction moratoriums. Here in Washington, our moratorium ended in July, but our governor has limited some evictions through October 31st with the hope that rent assistance and other protections will be fully operational by then, and that will stave off the evictions that we might otherwise see. What did eviction moratoriums nationally and in states and cities across the country mean for renters? And what happens now that the national moratorium has been lifted and many states and local communities moratoriums have expired?
Sure. So the federal eviction moratorium was a crucial public health intervention during the pandemic. And it was historic. You know, having a federal eviction moratorium is unique. It's the first time in our country's history that the federal government has intervened in the rental market in that way. And it was a very important intervention to keep tens of millions of people who otherwise would have lost their homes during a global health emergency stably housed during it. And the moratorium was flawed from the outset. It had a number of holes in it through which many renters fell, and evictions proceeded at pace in some communities. But overall, it's been proven that the federal eviction moratorium lowered the number of eviction filings by at least 1.5 million. That's 1.5 million families at minimum who didn't lose their homes during the pandemic because of that protection. But also from the outset, the eviction moratorium on its own was always a half measure because the rent was still due and tenants were accruing more debt than they could possibly pay off in their lifetimes. And landlords, and especially small landlords, weren't getting the rental income that they rely on to pay their bills, to continue to operate and maintain their properties. That's why it's always been so essential that the federal eviction moratorium be paired with substantial emergency rental assistance. And as you all know, Congress did provide also unprecedented historic level of resources to assist renters and landlords with the rent arrears that accrued. They appropriated $46.5 billion in emergency rental assistance. Unfortunately, that money is getting out in most places much too slowly to reach all the tenants and landlords who need it to keep tenants stably housed. So as of now, the best gauge we have throughout the country in terms of who's still struggling, who's behind on rent, is the Census Pulse survey data. And that shows us that there are still about 6.5 million families who are behind on rent, and about half as many of them are concerned they may lose their homes to eviction or other types of housing instability in the next couple of months. So now that the federal eviction moratorium has been lifted and many, really most, state and local eviction protections are gone, those 6.5 million families are at heightened risk of losing their homes in the coming weeks and months, unless and until that emergency rental assistance reaches them and their landlords to keep them stably housed.
Thank you. Emily, you noted before that, because of many of the things that Diane just talked about, and because of the moment we're in, policymakers are paying more attention to housing than ever before. Can you speak a little bit to what's unique about this moment we're in as it relates to the possibility of congressional action on affordable housing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we all know that we're looking at potentially the biggest investment in affordable housing, perhaps ever, depending on how this process plays out. When Diane and I used to both work together at Enterprise a few years ago, we were fighting to even keep affordable housing programs in the tax code period during tax reform and reconciliation. And to think we went from telling Congress you have to keep private activity bonds in the tax code or we're going to lose 1 million units over the next 10 years, to now being at a point where we're saying, are we going to be able to create 2 million more affordable homes? Is it going to be 1 million? To have seen the pendulum swing this far, for those of us who, especially those of us who work on tax policy, where bills are pretty few and far between, it's a really exciting time to think that we might not just be nibbling around the edges, trying to get a little something here and there in a year-end tax bill, but actually be able to take some of these provisions we've been advocating for since 2016 in the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act and actually get them across the finish line. So I don't want to jump ahead too far. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about where we are and how we can get some of these proposals over the finish line. But with the stars having aligned with an administration saying we actually want to tackle the affordable housing crisis, not just kind of plug holes here and there, to have congressional leadership saying that that they're supportive as well, to have seen this House bill, or I guess it hasn't totally made it yet, but to have seen the House committees pass these bills out with really things we've been asking for so long on affordable housing. It is a very exciting moment, but we've also unfortunately now seen what a really good bill could look like, and we know that it's going to have to change. So it is both exciting, but also means we have a lot of work to do. And even if we've been doing all the work to get us to this point, we have to continue doing the work every single day until this reconciliation process is wrapped up, because everything's at risk right now. And so we have to try to get some of this stuff across the finish line.
Thank you. Diane, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Emily said, I mean, it's truly an extraordinary moment. And it's extraordinary not only because we have already this abundance of resources to address the rent arrears that accrued during the pandemic. We have this obvious and tremendous need for long-term solutions. And we have this moment unlike any in my 25-year career, where we were so close to being able to achieve the level of sustained investments needed to end homelessness in our country. It's also an extraordinary moment, or a moment, I think, where we have to recognize that people are tired and advocates are feeling a little bit of advocacy fatigue, of general fatigue, right? We all are. We've been doing this now for 19 months. We've been sprinting through this marathon. And every time at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, we continue to urge advocates to act. It's a moment of historic importance. There's the possibility of unprecedented resources. We've been saying that over and over for the last 19 months, and it's been true every time. And I completely understand how tired people feel. And I want to say how grateful I am for the incredible work that people in the housing field and the homelessness field have been doing for the last 19 months, and the advocacy that you've done. And to say, we can't stop now. This really is the moment that we have been waiting decades for. And this moment won't come again for at least years and maybe decades. And we have this opportunity to do what we've been trying to do for so long. It's very real, it's very possible, or it could all slip away in a matter of weeks. And we have to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and that's up to all of us adding our voice. And thank you to NLHC and your whole team for rallying us over and over and over again. We really appreciate it. So Emily, I think everybody probably who's here today has been, like me and like you two much more closely, have been watching as Congress negotiates the infrastructure package, the Build Back Better Act, and all the permutations of that. Since this is happening like literally right now, this week, and next week, and who knows how much longer, but it's literally happening right now, and things are changing all the time. Can you give us an update on where exactly things are?
I'll do my best. Who knows what's happened in the 15 minutes since we started talking here. Definitely face that risk right now with things changing by the minute and the hour. But the quick overview of kind of how we got here is this two-track process. There's the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which passed the Senate a few weeks ago, and they're holding on to it until they have the Build Back Better plan ready. You all saw your home state member, Congresswoman Jayapal, said, you don't have the votes to bring the bipartisan bill. Don't even bring it to the House floor unless you can assure us we're getting, maybe it doesn't have to be $3.5 trillion, but it's got to be a significant investment in these human infrastructure priorities. So it got tabled, much to the dismay of the House moderates, and basically now they bought themselves a few more weeks to try to come up with a Build Back Better plan that can not only appease the House progressives and moderates, but also the Senate moderates. We all learned on Friday, we knew that the Senate moderates were going to probably not go for a $3.5 trillion bill. We saw Joe Manchin's number, or at least his starting point on Friday. There are some signs today that he might be willing to go up to more of a 2.2 trillion. So there's a back and forth there. Of course, we don't know what Senator Sinema's demands are going to be as well, but needing to see what the House passed, which, as we all saw, was a really nice bill for housing. And sorry, I should stop saying what the House passed, but the House is prepared to pass based on what its committees put together, and trying to see how much of that they can fit into something that the Senate will ultimately go for. So there's some decisions that need to be made right now that have not really trickled down to the rank and file members yet, but leadership in the White House are having to decide, in order to bring 3.5 trillion down to whatever number it is, are they going to do a few priorities and fund them fully, or are they going to kind of spread the cuts around, but also spread the benefits around, or some combination? So it's not clear yet which direction they're going to go. I'm sure we all saw the article over the weekend saying that housing could be just housing generally, not even a specific housing program, but that housing as a concept could be on the cutting room floor, which is why we've all been, even though we're tired, reaching out again and again and saying, you know, when is the next time we're going to be able to do something like this? And this Build Back Better plan was supposed to create 2 million more affordable homes, which we can't do if you don't make these housing investments. So that's kind of where we are right this second. For those of you who are reaching out to members of Congress, I'm sure a lot of them are saying, we're waiting to hear from leadership. That's the response we get most often, but even members of Congress who've been going to leadership need to keep going as well, because right now is when they're making these decisions. And I also just want to acknowledge, you know, the two foremost Democratic leaders on the low-income housing tax credit, Marie Cantwell and Susan DelBene. You all have done a tremendous job turning them into real champions for the program, but they're really having to fight right now. And anything you can do to both thank them and keep reminding them of the immediate impacts and benefits that some of the provisions they've been fighting for on the credit could have is just that fuel they need as they keep going back again and again to Speaker Pelosi, to Chairman Neal, to Chairman Wyden, to Leader Schumer. So I don't know, Diane, you may have some more breaking news to add or any other thoughts, but I think that's kind of where we are at this moment.
Yeah, I think that was a good overview, Emily.
Thank you. Well, let's get into some specifics then. First about what the Biden administration initially proposed, and then about, you know, what the House proposed. So speaking of the Biden's proposal, what affordable housing investments did the Biden administration initially propose as part of the Build Back Better agenda in terms of both spending on current and new housing programs? And so Diane, if you could take that, as well as in tax incentives. And Emily, if you could take that one.
Yeah, so this process started back in March, and even before the Biden administration came out with its Build Back Better plan, which it wasn't called that at the time. It's been called like 4 different things over the course of as many months. But I want to just back up a little bit, but to like early mid-March, when at the National Income Housing Coalition, we launched our Housed campaign for universal, stable, affordable homes. And our goal in launching that campaign was to continue the momentum and the success we had during the pandemic in mobilizing over 2,300 organizations for Rent Relief Now to pivot to the long-term solutions, seeing that there was going to be this opportunity with an infrastructure/reconciliation package. So President Biden first came out then in late March with his proposal for both infrastructure, then there was the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan. And in it all, he proposed a little over $200 billion for affordable housing. That included both direct spending, primarily through HUD, and tax incentives for affordable housing, $213 billion in total. It didn't have a lot of specificity. It did specifically call for $40 billion in public housing capital repairs. And it mentioned additional money to build more affordable housing. There was nothing for vouchers. There was nothing specifically for the Housing Trust Fund. And our priorities from the beginning, what we've been calling for has been universal housing vouchers, as President Biden called for during his campaign. We've been pushing for at least $70 billion in public housing capital repair dollars, and $45 billion a year for the Housing Trust Fund. So the first proposal from President Biden was a significant request. It didn't have everything that we wanted or the funding levels that we wanted. So we kept pushing. And by the end of May, President Biden, he increased his own ask, which I have to say, I haven't seen that before. So the president said, initially he asked for $213 billion. He increased his own ask up to $318 billion. And again, that included both direct spending and tax incentives. It still had the $40 billion for public housing capital repairs. Now it included $45 billion for the Housing Trust Fund, and it still didn't have anything for Section 8 vouchers. So we continued pushing, and we worked with these tremendous congressional champions, including Maxine Waters and Sherrod Brown and Richie Torres, to push them to do more. And now we have what's, as Emily mentioned, what is the House bill, which has $327 billion in the direct spending alone. Emily will talk in a moment about the tax side, but that $327 billion, that's funding that's overseen by the House Financial Services Committee. And it includes $90 billion in rental assistance. That's $75 billion for new vouchers and $15 billion for project-based rental assistance. Altogether, that $90 billion in rental assistance would mean 1 million more families housed over the next several years. The Build Back Better Act also includes $80 billion for public housing capital repairs, so even above what we were asking for. And that's primarily thanks to Senator Schumer, the majority leader, who is from the state of New York with NYCHA and its tremendous public housing capital needs. And it includes $37 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. So it's been just even over the last several months, we've made tremendous progress in getting this level of funding on the table in the reconciliation bill. And now we need to get it across the finish line.
Thank you. Emily, do you want to talk about the tax incentives?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of those times where, it's interesting because I think the average, taxpayer doesn't really care if the housing program that's being funded is coming out of the tax committee or the banking or financial services committee. But right now it makes a huge difference in kind of the lay of the land for the different housing programs. So when the reconciliation process started, there was an instruction to spend, over $300 billion on housing programs. So we sort of knew that that was coming, which was amazing. In the tax committees, they basically were told, they have to raise all the money for what's going to offset and pay for this reconciliation bill. And so it's this kind of complicated thing where they're coming up with both the pay fors for this whole bill, what's the corporate rate going to be, what's the international tax system going to look like, and also saying, whatever you raise over there is going to help pay for whatever you want to do on these community development tax incentives. So it's a little bit arcane, but it made a big difference into how much money was available for the community development bucket. And they ended up, I think, distributing it in a way where, at least for the housing credit, we were able to fit in pretty much all of our top priorities that are going to be able to produce the most affordable housing. So we really appreciate the way that they gave us some of the provisions we wanted for as long as they could give us, even longer than we expected might be possible with all the technicalities of budget reconciliation. So we ended up with about the House Ways and Means Committee bill included about $30 billion worth of investments in the low-income housing tax credit. It increases the annual allocation by actually more than 50%. It includes lowering the 50% test down to 25% for 7 years, which at least gives us enough time to start really taking advantage of it before we need to extend it again. That's something that's newer to the housing credit agenda, but as you all know in Washington, it's something that kind of jumps to the front of the list in terms of things that are really needed and could really have a huge impact. And frankly, outside of reconciliation, I think it would be pretty difficult to get something like this across the finish line. So that's why we're really trying to make sure we don't let this moment pass without lowering the 50% test. It included a few basis boosts. So we were really pleased. It's not the initial 2 million or so homes that could be financed by what the Biden administration initial proposal said, which was $55 billion for the housing credit, but it would get us about 1.3 million more affordable homes over the next 10 years, which is obviously the biggest jump since the program was even created in terms of what we could produce. I also, I know a lot of people are following the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, so that was included. That's one of those ones where, they're really fighting to stay in as the Senate's looking at it as well, since it is a new program and, sometimes expanding existing programs or making changes to them is easier than adding something new. Some of the other items on the table on the tax side did not make it in, like the middle income tax credit, which I know some groups are not a fan of. That did not make it. And part of that was because Chairman Wyden had said, they don't want to push the middle income tax credit till the low income housing tax credit has been meaningfully expanded. So we still need to see what the Senate puts together, but it was not in the House bill. And that's certainly a strong starting point. But I would also just flag on the community development side, extensions in new markets tax credit, big expansion of the historic tax credit. So we'll see how much, we can get all of this across the finish line. We're focused on the low-income housing tax credit, but those are some of, I just wanted to also kind of give an outline of some of the other considerations and community development credits on the table. And of course, the Ways and Means and Finance Committee have to figure out how to offset all of that too.
Thank you. So Emily, you sort of noted earlier that, we've seen what an amazing bill, what a really robust set of investments can look like. And that may not be exactly where we end up. Can you talk a little bit about where we go from here? Now that the price tag of the Build Back Better plan may have to come down in order to secure enough votes for passage, and how might that impact affordable housing priorities?
Call your members of Congress again, even if it's Maria Cantwell, even if it's Susan Del Bene, and say, we know you're fighting. Thank you. What do you need from us? Because everyone at the leadership level is trying to balance pretty much every single Democratic priority that is now seeing their one train leaving the station and trying to get as much as they can. So we can't let our foot off the gas until it's over. In terms of where affordable housing is going to fit ultimately, because of some of the things we've talked about. I mean, this is just my speculation at this point, but it's hard to imagine, Leader Schumer letting this bill pass without something for NYCHA. Having Speaker Pelosi, not include something in there for affordable housing, representing California. So, I know that we're afraid housing could get cut completely. It could, which is why we have to make the case. I'm hopeful that they'll find a way to include some of it, but it's really just a question of how much are we going to have to come down from the House bill, and I don't think any of us know that answer yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think if I could just add on, I think it's unlikely that, as Emily said, and for the reasons she said, I think it's unlikely that housing altogether will be left out of the bill that moves forward. It is a possibility, because what congressional leaders in the White House right now are deciding is if they have to cut their package maybe by as much as half, do they still try to plant many, many seeds, or do they really go deep and big with just 2 or 3 things that they can show success over a few years? And they haven't decided yet which it's going to be. I think it's probably more likely that they're going to do multiple things in a shallower way, because they still need their whole caucus to stay together to get this bill across the finish line. And you start to lose a lot of members of Congress if you start cutting out entire pieces of the bill. What's my biggest fear is that they'll do what unfortunately members of Congress have done for decades, which is spread a limited amount of money out across dozens of programs in an attempt to make everybody happy. And if that's what we do, we not only risk missing the opportunity truly to end homelessness over the next decade, but we also pretty much guarantee that 10 years from now, we're not going to be able to show much impact at all from whether it's $100 billion or $200 billion. And if we can't show an impact in 5 or 10 years, we're not going to be able to get to universal vouchers or the universal and greater levels of spending that we need. So our pitch and our urging to members of Congress is that, especially as the total amount gets winnowed down, it's more important than ever to target those funds to those with the greatest needs and where we can show the greatest impact. And again, if we get funding for 1 million more families to get Section 8 vouchers, with the $90 billion in rental assistance, if we can build 330,000 more homes affordable to extremely low-income people, as we could with $37 billion in the Housing Trust Fund, and if we could preserve public housing for current and future residents, we could effectively end homelessness in our country. That's where the priority needs to be. Any cuts that come from the overall Build Back Better Act or from the housing provisions in the Build Back Better Act can't come at the expense of housing our country's lowest income and most marginalized people.
Thank you. So to make sure that doesn't happen, Diane, what can affordable housing advocates be doing right now?
Well, absolutely. We need to get as many calls as we can into members of Congress, both our friends and those who have not been with us. Even if your member of Congress is one of the greatest affordable housing champions, they need to hear from you right now to stay strong and hold the line. I mean, Congresswoman Jayapal has been phenomenal, and it's because of her that there is still a real possibility of getting this level of investments this year. So she needs to hear from you too. She needs to hear our thanks and our gratitude and our urging her to keep going. And other members need to hear too. In terms of like a very concrete action that people can take right now, Congressman Richie Torres from New York is circulating a Dear Colleague letter, which means he's written a letter to all of his colleagues in the House of Representatives, urging them to join him in making the same asks that I just made to all of you, that if there are cuts in the Build Back Better Act, that they not come at the expense of housing the lowest income people, and that rental assistance, the Housing Trust Fund, and public housing be fully funded in the final bill. So we need as many members as possible to sign on to that Dear Colleague letter by the end of the week. So that's an immediate action I would ask everybody to take is after this conversation to call your member of Congress, urge them to sign on to Representative Richie Torres's Dear Colleague letter so they can keep showing their support for these investments.
Great. Thank you, Diane. And I will say that I personally yesterday emailed the housing staffers in every one of our House members' offices and asked them to sign on to that letter. And I've gotten a few responses, no final commitments yet. So for folks who are participating in this panel today, you can amplify that by doing exactly what Diane just recommended, which is you can call your members of Congress and ask them the same thing. They should have that request from me yesterday, and the more voices, the better. So thank you for that. So question to both of you. Obviously, there's
before we move off of that question, you mind if I just add a couple other things since it's a
Please
little
do.
bit different marching order on the housing credit. So I think we've made the point, you know, no matter how much of a champion your member is, no matter how many times you've reached out to keep it up, on the housing credit, it's, you know, there's not a specific letter circulating right now. Susan Galbene did do one a couple of weeks ago. So thank you for helping to get a lot of the Washington delegation sign on to that. The ask on the housing credit side is just to have members go to leadership and not only Schumer and Pelosi, but also the tax committee leaders and say they'd like to see the housing credit provisions in the final bill. It's a little bit more complicated on the ask on the housing credit side because it's not just like a dollar amount, you know, we had this much and, you know, it needs to be minimally this much. It's a set of provisions. And what I would say is, unless you really want to, and feel free to reach out to me, just saying we want to see housing credit investments in the bill is really all you need to say, because, you know, they might end up tinkering with some things like maybe, you know, it's a 5-year phase in on the allocation increase instead of a 4-year phase in. You know, we don't need to kind of get into that back and forth. I would just say, go to members, say we want you to ask for housing credit investments to leadership.
Great. Thank you so much for adding that. So to both of you, obviously there's a lot around the budget right now, but can you talk a little bit about any other steps that you think we should know about that the Biden administration is taking to address affordable housing outside of the legislative process?
Sure. So they are very focused right now on, in terms of housing, the Biden administration is very focused, one, on getting the emergency rental assistance out to the tenants who need it. And they're doing a lot of really, I'd say appropriately aggressive things to push states and cities to do better and do more faster and get that money out. They are also, of course, very focused on this reconciliation package, and it's taking up a lot of time and energy from everybody in the administration to be doing this negotiation about the spending levels, but also the legislative language around it. After that, you know, and I have to say, when we're successful in getting the reconciliation package and these funding allocations done, because I can't fathom otherwise, but then there's a lot of work to be done to improve these programs, to ensure that they work for the lowest income, most marginalized, and especially for people of color. For example, in some ways, when it comes to major voucher expansion, in some ways, we're doing this backwards, right? We're going to get, hopefully, a major down payment towards universal vouchers for all families who need them. But we still have a lot to do to fix the program and fix state and local environments, their housing finance systems, to ensure that Black and brown renters, when they receive a voucher, can actually use it. So things like source of income discrimination protections are very important, but there's also a lot of work that the Department of Housing can, and I know intends to do, to look more closely at the program, to hear directly from tenants who use vouchers, from landlords who receive them, from the many more who need them, about ways that they can start to improve this program so that it works better on the ground, especially for people of color. And I think we'll see that across programs, certainly in the Department of HUD, but I think also at Treasury and at VA, even HHS that works on homelessness. We're going to see a lot more effort to advance racial equity with programs that exist. And there are dozens of staff within each building that are focused on that, really laser focused about how do we utilize the resources and the programs that we have now to do better towards achieving, to remedying racial injustice and actually achieving racial justice through these programs.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I'll flag just a few other things. One is, I mean, I want to give this administration a lot of credit for just having hired a lot of housing people, we all know, and having come in with a lot of plans. And, you know, it seems like a million years ago, but between the time, you know, the administration, the presidential election was called and the Senate races were called in January, there was 2 months where, you know, everyone, including all of us, were preparing for divided government this year, and, you know, what can be accomplished for housing in, you know, potential legislative gridlock. And I think that the administration came up with some pretty good ideas then that they ended up implementing anyway, in addition to possibly having, you know, some huge legislation for housing moving forward. So things like working with FHFA, they just increased the amount that the GSEs can each invest in the low-income housing tax credit, which is especially important if we're hopefully looking at a further expansion of the program to make sure the investor appetite is there and kind of turn those dials. And they've been engaging with LIHTC stakeholders quite a bit to make sure Fannie and Freddie's role in the market is appropriate. One of the other things we've been watching, which has turned from fear to opportunity, is CRA reform, which is obviously important for a number of reasons, but it's specifically the main incentive for investment in affordable housing. And the rule that the OCC came out with last year, we were concerned would have really diluted the incentive to invest in affordable housing. And so we've appreciated seeing a series of definitive steps, announcements, regulations, everything we need to give us the comfort that that rule is never going to be implemented and will instead be replaced with something that's hopefully a joint regulation between 3 regulators, which not only modernizes CRA and takes steps towards addressing redlining and a lot of the issues from the past that we're still working through, but also can really increase investment in affordable housing. So that's an opportunity as well. And I also just want to give HUD credit for advocating for the housing credit as part of their vision as well. Kind of like we were talking about with the committees, having all of the HUD programs in one committee and then LIHTC over in the tax committee. So you have a whole different set of policymakers working on these different housing issues. Often because LIHTC's at Treasury, it kind of flies under the radar at HUD aside from a few offices. And HUD has been very clear from the secretary down that LIHTC needs to be part of achieving the production goals that the administration wants to achieve, and just how, and a recognition of how much the credit works with all of these other programs that are essential to kind of having a full housing ecosystem. So we're very encouraged by all of these kind of, while we're still working through this legislative process, all of the steps being taken in the administration in the meantime.
Thank you. Well, we have just a few minutes for some questions. So I'll invite folks who are tuning in. If you've got questions, feel free to use the chat in the conference, the platform to ask your question. I do see a couple here. I think, Diane, this is a question for you. Can you talk about what guidance is available to getting rent assistance out the door? And what can you share about the federal government's plans to claw back funds from localities and places that aren't distributing them effectively?
Sure. So at the National Income Housing Coalition, we've been tracking all emergency rental assistance programs that were created during the pandemic, including about 600 of them in 2020 using much more limited CARES Act funds, and now tracking about 500 emergency rental assistance programs that are utilizing the much bigger allocation that came from Congress in December 2020. And as we're doing that work, we're analyzing and researching what's working and what's not, and pulling out best practices, pulling out the attributes of successful programs. And they're pretty simple. You know, successful programs that are spending their money fast have simple applications. They use self-attestation for eligibility. They do robust and equitable outreach. They do direct-to-tenant assistance when landlords refuse to participate. And we put out multiple research studies and best practices that make the case for each of those. And it's all available on our website, along with our database, our searchable database of all ERA programs, and much more information. The White House and the Department of Treasury, we've worked really closely with them since they came into office, and they have been very responsive to all of the times that we've kind of lifted up the obstacles that we've seen or the roadblocks and our recommendations for correcting them. And they put out many sets of guidance, really urging program administrators to do what we've been urging them to do as well. Now, at the end of September, the law allows for, or requires really, that the Department of Treasury start to recapture funds that have not been spent and reallocate them to communities that are spending the money and that have greater needs. So for that, we have urged the administration to be very careful when doing that. One, to make sure that tenants are held harmless for slow or poor performing ERA programs. So in other words, if a tenant lives in a community where their program administrator is just not spending the money, not following White House guidance, that tenant still needs the assistance, and we have to make sure that they get it. So the White House is taking care to consider how to hold tenants harmless, make sure that all tenants and landlords still get the assistance they need, but also to require programs that are not spending the money to put forward a performance improvement plan. That's a new requirement. And those performance improvement plans have to show how are they going to start to utilize these best practices? How are they going to course correct and improve their programs to get them working better and faster? And if by November 15th, they're still not improving their programs and they still haven't reached a certain threshold of spending and obligation, then that money is going to start to be swept back, and it's going to be reallocated to other entities in the same community that can spend the money, or in some cases to other states and some other cities. In some cases, there's about a handful of states that received more ERA than they need because the formula was faulty from the beginning. It was based only on population and not number of renters or number of low-income renters. So South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, they got more ERA than they need. So that money too will start to be swept and sent to cities like in Washington State or New York or California that have more need than the ERA that they received. So Treasury just put out that guidance this week. And in the next day or two, they're going to put out more of a kind of checklist for what they're going to be looking for in these performance improvement plans from states and cities.
Thank you. I see a question here from Brooke, and hi Brooke. Brooke's a resident action project leader, asking what we can do to promote the high, oh, I'm sorry, wrong question. The question is there opposition to the things that we're asking for? Are members of Congress hearing from anybody on the other side, or is it really just about competing priorities and interests?
I think it's really competing interests. I mean, for all the many years, we were trying to get housing on the radar. Many of us, we've been hearing about infrastructure week for years, and we've been trying to make the case that housing is infrastructure. I think the case has really been made, got a lot of members pushing for it. You can look at any of these, housing bills and sign-on letters. You get, half a Democratic caucus on any given one of them. It's just, they also want to deal with the climate crisis and healthcare and childcare, and that's the problem right now is you take all of these priorities that everyone's, finally getting to see their chance, just like we are, and you add them all together, it ends up being quite a bit more than 3.5 trillion. And that's, where we're kind of coming down from at this point. So I don't know if Diane's heard any different. I personally haven't heard any opposition to housing generally, or even any specific housing program. It's just how all the different pieces fit together.
Yeah, I think that's right, except for the enigma of Kristen Sinema, who nobody knows quite what it is she opposes or what she's for. But I will say that even Senator Joe Manchin, he is of course one of the moderate Democrats who's insisting that the overall price tag come down. He's laid out kind of a set of principles that he wants to see throughout the entire reconciliation package, whatever gets funded. And his focus is, as Emily said earlier, no new programs. So he wants to focus on expanding existing programs. And he's very focused on means testing and on targeting. And however any of us feel about that for programs outside of housing, it does put all of our asks for affordable housing certainly within the realm of what follows the principles that he laid out. So I agree, especially on the Democratic side, and since this will be a Democratic only bill, I don't have concerns about members of Congress being opposed to any of these pieces. It's just a matter of so many competing priorities.
Thank you. There's another question here. A very specific question. Could either of you address the potential increase to the USDA Rural Development 515 program and the ability to use that money for new construction and support around that proposal?
That's a great question, but I can't answer that off the top of my head. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, Corby, we'll try to see if we can find an answer to that and follow up with you later.
My colleague could answer that right off the top of her head, but I can't.
Right.
Sorry.
Sarah Sadian?
Yes, Sarah
and
Sadian.
Sarah will be speaking at an upcoming session. So Corby,
Great,
maybe
so ask her
look for
that.
Sarah's session.
First question. You can tell her Diane and Emily passed the buck.
Okay, so one last question, and this is not a specific question. This is a big question. So I'll just ask you to share sort of broad thoughts on this because I think it's important. Anna is asking, is anyone else still wondering what we can actually do to advocate in a way that is compellingly holistic? We try to treat the symptoms of racism, but what about the systemic underlying issues? Whose responsibility is that? It would take a radical leader, but our country doesn't like them either. Again, that's not a specific question. That's a big question, but I would love to hear your thoughts on sort of holistic advocacy around racial justice and housing as we wrap up here.
Well,
go ahead, Emily. No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I wish I had a more concise answer to that very good question. What I will note is, there's been a lot of proposals from Congress about kind of tackling racial inequality. And a few of us were talking this morning about how we were sort of surprised we haven't heard that come up more as part of the Build Back Better plan. And I'm just sort of surprised that some of the elements that are included in the plan at the moment, like some of these housing investments that have appeared in racial justice and racial equity kind of platforms that Congress has put out before, it's not being discussed as much by the congressional, negotiators as part of this plan. But it is such an important part of the lens that we're, deciding when we have all these competing priorities. What are we trying to do here? It's kind of moved away from being just a traditional infrastructure bill, and it's human infrastructure. But what does that mean? Are we tackling racial inequality? Are we strengthening the middle class? Are we serving the most in need? And I think, those are some of the big decisions that they're grappling with right now that I don't know if we have answers to, frankly. But I think that, raising those points about how critical housing is to these discussions of racial equity is something that we should all be doing, and reminding policymakers that, you've acknowledged how important it is before that this be part of that. So, here we've got bunch of answers for you that are kind of ready to go if you just make sure we include housing in this legislation.
Yeah, and I would just say, that's a question that deserves a whole hour-long panel and conversation to respond to thoroughly. But just in the 30 seconds that we have left, I would say that given the very clear and purposeful racist housing and transportation policies over decades that led to so many of the inequities, the structural inequities, and ongoing discrimination that exists today. It's so clear that housing policy has to be at the center of any solutions to racial inequities. There can't be racial justice unless and until there's housing justice, and housing justice done with a racial equity lens. So just as we've had decades of racist housing policies that created this yawning generational wealth gap that creates so many inequities today, now we need purposefully and deliberately anti-racist policies in order to rectify the inequities and start to work towards true housing justice that has racial justice at its center.
Absolutely. Thank you both. That's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you again, Emily and Diane, for being here today. There's a lot of information in a very compact amount of time. We appreciate your work and your leadership, and we're grateful to you for spending time with us this afternoon. Thank you. And I believe that now we will be moving on to a Friend of Housing Award.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicole Bascom. I am a Housing Finance Commission board member, an executive with U.S. Bank, and the owner and designated broker of Bascom Real Estate Group. I am excited to present a very prestigious award to a truly exceptional person. The award is the Margaret CV Lifetime Achievement Award, and the person is Tony Toe of Homesite. Throughout his 25 years at Homesite, 15 as executive director, Tony helped to build a strong and effective organization dedicated to homeownership, affordable homeownership, business development, and community advocacy, rooted in Central and South Seattle, but later stretching across the state. But he also worked tirelessly in a myriad of boards and policy committees to remove barriers to homeownership and community development. His impact has truly been monumental. And for me, as a current board member of Homesite, it has truly been my honor and privilege to continue the work he's done, particularly given I grew up in one of those communities that he helped to serve. Please join me in congratulating Tony Toe.
Hey Tony, it's so great that you're getting this Margaret CV Lifetime Achievement Award. I want to acknowledge you for all the years you have spent working in the housing sector. You have been the consummate champion of equity in every meeting. You've reminded us about the importance of community, and you've shown the respect that we all need to have for the viability of homeownership as a way to create wealth and change people's lives. I am really grateful to you for all that you have taught me and for those moments that you have waited in every meeting to bring forth all of those important points. This has been a great time for me, getting to know you and work with you over the years, and we really appreciate you, and we honor you with this special award.
Hi, I'm here on Lake Washington near Seward Park, where Beth and I do morning walks year-round. We come here to watch the birds and the foliage change as the seasons change, and we'll be doing more of that now that both of us are retired. I want to thank the Washington State Housing Finance Commission and the Planning Committee for selecting me to receive the Margaret CV Lifetime Achievement Award. I'm deeply grateful because this award is from you, people whom I have worked with and conspired with over my 28 plus years at Homesite. As for the future, it's been a hell of a last 18 to 24 months. The fight for racial justice and equity, bearing witness to one disaster after another wrought by climate change, and dealing with the effects and the impacts of COVID has been a heavy burden for all of us. But I think the key is inclusion and power sharing, especially with those most impacted and who share our commitment for a better future. So moving forward, I think putting curing and healing in the forefront, even as we deal with the symptoms, is going to be the most effective way to proceed. I wish you all the best, and my heart and minds will be with you in our continued fight. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for being here with us this afternoon. Congratulations, Tony, on that well-deserved recognition. And thanks again to all of our speakers, to Diane and Emily today. And we're going to take a short break now, and we'll be back with the next session starting at 1:10. Thank you all and see you soon.